Welcome back, students. We're now going to go through to Learning Outcome 1.2, in which we discuss the context and the notions behind the post-colonial style of writing and whether you think Heart of Darkness is post-colonial or not. Now, that is the overarching theme I want you to focus on, because it is the notion that is going to stick with us through way to the end of the series of lectures. So we have talked about colonialism in the previous set of slides, given you a couple of ideas. What I want to do in this set of slides is I want to define post-colonialism. I want to explain what post-colonialism is. I want to explain how this text may or may not be a post-colonial text. So the first thing I want to do is give you a sort of idea of what post-colonialism is. Now, post-colonialism was a reaction to the end of colonialism. It was a reaction to when the colonial powers left these areas and gave independence back to the indigenous populations, which is a phrase I rather hate using, when it gave power back to the people who belonged there, what they did was these writers went and discussed what the consequences of this were. How did it feel to have this power vacuum for a start, and what did it feel like to have your entire existence before now predicated on somebody else controlling you? So these are four of the big post-colonial theorists that you might come across. So the one is Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak, so she is an Indian lady. Edward Said, who was a South American theorist, and he is one of the first theorists that came up with a lot of the words that we are going to use about post-colonialism and the post-colonial identity. We then have Homi Bhabha and Fanon. Frans Fanon was a North African writer. He came from one of the French colonized countries, and he expresses a lot of the ideas from an African perspective. And it's why it's so important to know these people and know these names, because these are peoples that are discussing colonialism from different perspectives. If you think about it, we have Africa, we have India, and we have South America. And all of these were colonized at some point or another. Some of the colonialism has much long-lasting effects. Think about the languages that are resonating still in these countries, and think about what population groups are still existing in these countries, where an entire population may or may not be entirely wiped out. And it's important to keep in mind that everyone's and every country's experience of colonialism would have been different because of the colonial powers that had been there in the first place. So how do we define it? And I'm going to ask you to do this activity, and I think you should discuss this with your lecturers. And what you should do is think about how we define post-colonialism. And I've broken it down into 4 sections that should be quite helpful. The first is, what does post in post-colonialism refer to? What does it mean to say post-colonialism? What does post refer to? The second one is, what countries were affected by colonialism and have therefore engaged in post-colonialism? So what identity do we ascribe? What countries do you think are most affected by it? Who are the creators, writers, theorists of post-colonialism? I'm not looking for individual names here. I'm asking who is writing in a post-colonial style. Who are the people? Not individual names, what groups of people? And then lastly, what are the central concerns? So having looked at those 4 questions, I want you to break them up, think about them, brainstorm them, and then come up with a working definition for post-colonialism. In the previous slide, I had 2 videos, one of which was done by a American professor, where he talks about how he is a post-colonial theorist, and he finds it difficult to define post-colonialism. So while you're doing that, you can be aware of that. This is not an easy field to define and explain. So here are the central ideas that we need to think about and discuss and be very aware of when we're talking about post-colonialism. Post-colonialism thinks about these ideas and talks about how they are the residual effects of colonialism in different countries. So the first one is othering, and this is very important in Heart of Darkness, because there's always going to be an idea of me versus the other, me versus you. And who falls on the other side of that bandwagon? Who falls on the other side of that line? And what it is to make someone other than you? What are the identities that we limit and create for somebody to fall into that makes them different from us. The next one is mimicry. At what point do people start mimicking the identity of the colonizer because that's a survival technique? And how much of that is resonating still today? Binaries. Binaries are quite interesting because if we think about binaries, generally we think about simple things like good and evil, black and white, sun and moon. You think about things that are contrasting and opposites, which relates a lot to othering. Who is on the other side of the binary which you fall into? The next one is hegemony. Hegemony is quite a complicated discussion, and it's a complicated term, but basically on a superficial level, it means power relationships within groups and how some relationships are instilled and created to consistently and always benefit one group over another, and how problematic that can become. And that's something that as South Africans we need to think about. Is there a hegemonic system that we still fall into? Are we still experiencing hegemony? The next thing is primitivism and savagery. How much of what we are experiencing in terms of racism and the racist dialogues that we experience still fall into this, where they still fall into this trend of calling people primitive or savage? And think about how people are labeled based on this perception of being less civilized. The next idea that postcolonialism discusses is heterogeneous, or being heterogeneous, which means groups of people that are grouped together because they are different, not because they are the same. And this is a great idea to just link back into South Africa and talk about the Rainbow Nation, because that's exactly what we are. We are a heterogeneous state. We are made up of many, many different cultures, religions, languages, and identities. And lastly, civilization. What makes a country or an identity or a group of people be considered as civilized versus a group of people who are not? And what affects that? So, one of the things I mentioned earlier on is the idea of Heart of Darkness being a colonial text versus a post-colonial text. And something that I would like to posit to you is that it straddles the line. It doesn't necessarily stand on one end or another. What it does is it walks that line because it was written during the colonial era, and post-colonialism was only starting to sort of poke its tendrils out. It was only starting to assume an identity towards the end of when Heart of Darkness was written, and much later. Post-colonialism only really assumed a full identity from the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. And some of them only came into writing in the 60s and 70s. So when we're talking about Heart of Darkness and when it was written, this was long before post-colonialism had an identity. It was usually a sort of a group of ideas that were loosely strung together. But what Heart of Darkness does is it's an indictment of colonialism. Written during the colonial era, Heart of Darkness goes, this is wrong. What we are doing is wrong. And as somebody who is part of that society, he's pointing at the corruption, he's pointing at the violence, the exploitation, and he's pointing at the way that this is changing the identity of the colonizer into something that is far uglier than anything that we want to acknowledge from a colonial identity side. He's going, this is what we have become. This as a person who falls into the colonial field, this is what we've become. We've become these violent, greedy, mad people who are just abusing the population. We're abusing the land, we're abusing everything, and it's turning us into these monsters. And much of what this text is about is, where is the darkness actually? Is the darkness coming from Kurtz, or is the darkness coming from Africa? And a lot of the argument is that Heart of Darkness is so easy to be like, oh, well, he's mad because he's in Africa. And what this text is arguing is saying, no, Kurtz would have been a monster no matter where he was, but he was put in a position where he was given endless amounts of power and endless amounts of resources to do whatever he wanted. And he was supported because of his success. He was never indicted because of his aggression and violence. Now, a lot of what Conrad is discussing here is he's reflecting on the post-colonial works of this. He's reflecting on the pre-post-colonial works. He's reflecting on how colonialism was incredibly violent and how it was incredibly dangerous for not only the post-colonial identities and the populace that had been suppressed, but also for the colonial identities. What does it do to recognize that you have been enforcing a violent culture of abuse and pillaging and rape on an entire another civilization, on an entire another group of people, regardless of how civilized they were? So one of the things here is that if we want to simplify it, a simple question that he's asking is, what happens when those who have power exploit those below them? And in a simple version, that's what Kurtz is doing, is he is somebody with power, he's been given power and authority, and he takes it to the nth degree. If you're interested in this and you're interested in engaging with very complex texts that may not fall into the post-colonial identity, but do fall into the pre-post-colonial identity and do question colonization and the way colonization has engaged with the local groups of people, a text that's very useful is A Passage to India by Ian Foster, who discusses what happens when a white woman visits India. So a British girl, she goes to India, I think she's quite young at this point, and she's not getting the attention she wants, so she pretends to be raped by one of the local men. And the story goes from there. Obviously, we know it's a false accusation, something that we should be very aware of at this point in time. And it's not actually about the rape per se. What it's about is her exploiting power over another population. It's about her using the power that she has to take control of an entire group of people through one accusation and one sentence. So, Chinua Achebe, who is considered to be one of the great post-colonial voices of Africa from the 1960s, wrote a text called An Image of Africa, Racism in Conrad's Heart of Darkness. It's in your reader, and you really should engage with it, because what he does here is he posits a very complex discussion, because what he's saying is, it's all good and well to praise Heart of Darkness as a good post-colonial or pre-post-colonial text. I realize that that is an oxymoron. But what we're forgetting is that this is still a racist text. We cannot just ignore the racism that is profoundly visible in the text itself. So one of his thoughts are, Heart of Darkness projects the image of Africa as the other world, the antithesis of Europe, and therefore civilization, a place where man's vaunted intelligence and refinement are finally mocked by triumphant bestiality. And one of the arguments that he posits here is that the monstrosity of Kurtz and his violence, his aggression, and his awfulness, it is meant to be shown that this is allowed in Africa because Africa is the extreme opposite. It's the opposite of the civilization that is the Western world. And what he's suggesting that Africa is the binary of Europe. It is the opposite of what Europe stands for. So if Europe stands for civilization, for education, for moral goodness, for standards, for cleanliness, for all of these things, then Africa is meant to be held up as the opposite. It is meant to be the binary to this image. And this is obviously what his argument is going on about, and is saying this is problematic. We can look at Heart of Darkness and say Heart of Darkness might be a great discussion of how dark a human soul can get, but that doesn't mean that the imagery in it is less problematic, because it's still racist. So just so you guys know, I don't know if I explained this, all of the text that is in green is quotations from Achebe. Everything white is my own stuff. He does this by comparing two of the rivers that we see. We see the Thames, which I've actually put up a picture of here, where I can find my mouse. There it is. If you look at the Thames over here is this great symbol of an industry. It's a symbol of power, of commercialness, and success. Because if you think about it, the Thames is the lifeblood of London. And had the Thames not been as successful as it was, that island probably would have been ignored for a lot longer. And in contrast, he's comparing it to the image of the Congo River, which is meant to represent darkness and danger and wildness. And what Achebe says is this. Is Conrad saying that these two rivers are very different, one good, the other bad? Yes, but that's not the real point. It is not the differentness that worries Conrad, but the lurking hint of kinship, of common ancestry. For there Thames too has been one of the dark places of earth. It conquered its darkness, of course, and is now in daylight and at peace. So what the hint here is that, and this is where the racism becomes sort of profoundly obvious, is that although the text of Heart of Darkness is trying to illustrate the Thames as a space of profit and commercial goodness and vitality, and the image of the Congo River is dark and scary and dangerous, there's also the lurking hint that when you are comparing these two, it's that there's not actually that much different, and that all that the Congo is a forerunner, a previous version, or possibly a version that has embraced its darker side, whereas the Thames has cleansed itself and moved away from that. And this is a very, again, we're looking at the binary situation. Conrad is trying to put these two ideas at opposition to one another and do a deliberate comparison to them, showing how the one river, which is a representation of its civilization, has cleansed itself. It has become good. It has become clean, whereas the other has stayed in this dark, virulent, thickened space, which is dangerous and dark. One of the next things that he goes on to discuss is he takes this quotation and then he discusses an engagement about the problems that come with the way we look at Heart of Darkness, particularly from a Western perspective. So this is a quotation from Heart of Darkness. They were all dying slowly. It was very clear. They were not enemies. They were not criminals. They were nothing earthly now. Nothing but black shadows of disease and starvation, lying confusedly in the greenish gloom, brought from all the recesses of the coast in all the legality of time contracts, lost in uncongenial surroundings, fed on unfamiliar food. They sickened, they became inefficient, and then were allowed to crawl away and rest. Now, this set of imagery should be quite haunting because it's a description of how the slaves in Africa were treated. So what has happened here is these are West African slaves that have been brought to West African areas and put back into the plantations, so the rubber plantations at this time, but also they were hunting for ivory. And this is a description of how the people were treated quite literally like goods. And as soon as they were inefficient, they were allowed to just go and die. And these people were just confiscated from the land that they belonged to and put to work because somebody sold them. And what Achebe here says is the kind of liberalism espoused here by Marlowe and Conrad touched all the best minds in England, Europe, and America. It took different forms in the minds of different people, but almost always managed to sidestep the ultimate question of equality between white people and black people. So what he's arguing here is that this image is haunting, it's disturbing, and it highlights a reality that very few people want to really acknowledge. And what the biggest thing here, it instills in the reader a sense of pity and horror. And what it never does is it never makes someone realize, why are the white people being treated as different from the black people? Why are they not considered equals to one another? And do we think that this narrative is still sort of pervasive? Is this idea of human equality really been resolved? And I would say, look at what's happening in America now, because I don't think so. This is quite a long, complex discussion, but this is all about how we look at the way that Mr. Kurtz is portrayed. And this is very important because Mr. Kurtz obviously is the sort of central figure of the text next to Charles Marlowe. So, students of Heart of Darkness will often tell you that Conrad is concerned not so much with Africa as with the deterioration of one European mind caused by solitude and sickness. A Conrad student informed me in Scotland that Africa is merely the setting for the disintegration of the mind of Kurtz. Now, I want you to stop there for a second. Just think about how horrifying that is, because we can take the setting of colonial Africa that has been exploited and physically brutalized by an entire nation, and this book, this text, it's not really about Africa. The violence and things happening there are irrelevant. What we're more interested in is the psychological profiling and breakdown of Mr. Kurtz. And think about how horrifying that is for a student to say to somebody who has come from that, who has experienced that, and it lives consistently with the echoes and consequences of colonialism. So here, I've actually taken out excerpts that are from the same reading, obviously, but not necessarily directly following on. So this is, which is partly the point, Africa as a setting and a backdrop, which eliminates the African human factor. Africa as a metaphysical battlefield, devoid of all recognizable humanity, into which the wandering European enters at his peril. Can nobody see the preposterous and perverse arrogance in thus reducing Africa to the role of props for the breakup of one petty European mind? But that is not even the point. The real question is the dehumanization of Africa and Africans, which this age-long attitude has fostered and continues to foster in the world. As I said earlier, Conrad did not originate the image of Africa, which we find in his book. It was and is the dominant image of Africa in the Western imagination, and Conrad merely brought the peculiar gifts of his own mind to bear upon it. For reasons which can be certainly use close psychological inquiry, the West seems to have suffered deep anxieties about the precariousness of its civilization, and to have a need for constant reassurance by comparison to Africa. So basically, what the discussion that you should have about this is it okay Africa is demeaned to this backdrop role, and that the discussion of the violence endured by Africa during the colonial period, how is that sufficient to allow us to discuss the one psychological breakup of a character, a European character nonetheless? And something that's not referred to here, but is something that you should think about, is that none of the characters that are of African origin and descent have much depth. They are all superficial. They are almost all caricatures of one another. And this is something you should look at. You should think about how is it that these characters are constructed and portrayed? And how are these characters themselves also meant to be the antithesis of the European characters? So what I want you guys to do now is, in this, I want you to have a discussion about whether you think Hearts of Darkness is a colonial or post-colonial text. This should be an actual, at least a page-long discussion. And you need to provide reasons for your argument. These reasons can be entirely theoretical, but it also could be based on events from the novel. I want this to be instinctive. I want you to engage with the ideas that we've talked about, engage with the reading, engage with the text, and go, my gut tells me it is colonial, or my gut tells me it's post-colonial. And as you have figured, my line and my argument is that it straddles this line, and you are welcome to do the same. Okay, here's a really lovely download for you if you want. It's an incredible dictionary of all the post-colonial terms you could use that is very useful. And I will see you in the next set of slides.